When I come to the United States and I go to my hotel room in Charles Hotel and turn on the television, I feel that I've been cut off from the rest of the world. And literally, the insularity of the American discourse is actually frightening.
When you look at the world's top 20 universities, not a single university is from China, or at least top 10 universities. There's not one from China. So how is China going to address that issue if it's going to be the world number one power?
China's 9-dash claim on the South China Sea, some skirmishes along the way, and also the increasing militarization of China is growing defense budget. So my question to you is,
do you think there would be real press freedom, or artists would have freedom, or the Dalai Lama could come to Tibet?
大家好，我是老吴。上一期节目我们听了马凯硕先生在2015年哈佛大学演讲的主体部分，他向美国的精英们提出了一个核心问题：当美国不再是世界第一时，你希望未来的世界是什么样的？这一期节目我们就接着分享之后的问答环节。这场的哈佛师生向他提出了一系列很有意思的问题，范围很广，当然其中有一些非常尖锐。比如有人质疑中国没有顶尖大学如何成为强国，有人直接挑战中国的人权和自由问题，还有人从地缘安全的角度追问中国在南海的意图。那么面对这些来自西方顶尖学府的提问，马凯硕是如何应对的？他又是如何用他一贯的冷静和逻辑来化解这些难题的？接下来我们一起进入这场精彩的问答环节。
Good evening, sir. My name is Nico. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. I'm also the co-founder of the Future Society at the Kennedy School, which is a new student club. And my question regards the role of China, the future role of China in the Middle East. We've seen the Middle East being the big area of tension for the past decades. And I was surprised to see, if I recollect properly, that the first trip of the newly elected Egyptian president, Mohamed Morsi, at the time, was to go to China, not to the US, which I saw personally as a big sign. And I was wondering whether you could share with us your perspective of how the region, the Middle East, could change in this new era of Chinese rise. Thank you.
Should I answer?
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, this is actually a very difficult question to answer because, I mean, the tragedy about the Middle East is that it is the great exception in a world, as I try to demonstrate in the Great Convergence, which is actually prospering and doing very well. And because that region is a great exception, and to be very candid with you, it has a very dysfunctional dynamic. It is a very difficult region to have any kind of long-term posture or plans. I am very confident that the Chinese want to see stability in the Middle East, but the Chinese will never try to play the role of the United States, which is to go in there and intervene directly and try to influence the political development either inside countries, as with the invasion of Iraq, or in the relations between countries and so on and so forth. So when the Chinese emerge, the one thing they will not try to do is to try and replicate American policies in the Middle East.
So next question is right over here. Do note there's microphones here and here, and since I just go around, if you're standing in line, head to one of the other microphones.
Hello, my name is Patrick. Thanks so much for this very thoughtful and inspiring talk. As a German, I try to be the diplomat between the US and China. So my question is, how can millennials contribute to, as Kissinger would say, a peaceful coexistence between the US and China?
I think the millennials have an enormous contribution to make. And the first thing they should do is read my book, The Great Convergence. And I'll tell you, and it's a serious point I'm making here. I mean, I'm selling my book, but I'm also making a very serious point. The one key point that many people have not understood is that there are many respects in which the world has changed fundamentally. But one way in which it has changed fundamentally is that, and I use a simple boat metaphor to explain this change. In the past, when 7 billion people live in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 103 separate boats with captains and crews taking care of each boat and rules to make sure the boats didn't collide. Now that's the old world order. Now, what's happened is that the world has shrunk and it's become small, dense, interdependent. So the 7 billion people in the world no longer live in 193 separate boats. The 7 billion people literally live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. But you have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, and no captain or crew taking care of the global boat as a whole. And that's why you have global financial crisis, that's why you have global warming, that's why you have global terrorism, that's why you have global pandemics happening also. So I think my generation's problem is that we've got so used to the idea that the only way you solve the problems in the world is by getting independent sovereign countries to talk to each other and resolve the problems. But the world has changed so much that our ideas about how to handle the world of tomorrow are still bound by it's bound by 17th century Westphalian concept. So the millennials have to persuade the leaders of all the countries that the things that make us interdependent in the world are far greater than the things that divide us. And you've got to find a way of throwing away all the textbooks you use in the Harvard Kennedy School and write new textbooks.
So it's very clear we should put your textbook number one. There we go. Right here, please.
My name is Malik Siraj. I'm a mid-career MPA student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm a big fan of yours. I'm so glad to see you. My question is, I've been following your readings and Thomas Friedman and Fareed Zakaria, everybody talking about the post-American world. When you look at the world's top 20 universities, not a single university is from China, or at least top 10 universities. There's not one from China. You see, universities are not like stadiums that you're preparing for Olympic Games. It takes you 10 years to prepare stadiums. Like, look at institutions like Harvard or Yale, it has taken 300 years to establish institutions like Harvard. How is China planning to fill that gap of universities? Because like you so religiously talk about the power of higher education of institutions. So how is China going to address that issue if it's going to be the world number one power when like not a single university from China ranks among the top 10 universities in the world?
Yeah. Well, since I see quite a few questions, if you don't mind, I'm going to give very short, quick answers. Firstly, I'm very pleased to inform you that I think about 2-3 weeks ago, the New York Institute for International Education, IIE, came out with a new book called Asia as the Next Higher Education Superpower. And the introductory essay was co-written by me and a fellow author, the provost. Please read that essay because it actually gives you a lot of data to talk about trend lines. Yes, it's true that the largest, the best universities in the world are still in America, and so it'll take some time, but the trend line is very powerful in terms of development of new universities, institutions of higher education, and so forth. But the second point, which is a very critical point that I need to make here, is that America has been remarkably generous to the world by training the elites of the world in American universities. And I always say that one reason why East Asia has defied all conventional wisdom and why East Asia remains peaceful is that the elites in East Asia, including the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Taiwanese, the Indonesians, the Thais, the Singaporeans, and Malaysians, have all studied in American universities. And you know what happens? They use the same concepts, they understand each other, and they can get along with each other. Now, this is a remarkable contribution that American universities have made towards peace in East Asia that no one has fully recognized. So it's in fact good for the world that America retains the best universities as long as it continues to train the best minds from the rest of the world in these universities.
Right up here.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Wu. I'm a junior at Harvard College. My question is, when China, or if China becomes number one, what is the future for Hong Kong and the future for Taiwan?
Well, I think both will do very well. I mean, and for the simple reason that, there is what I call a rising tide of prosperity in the region. Now, they will have short-term political challenges. I mean, Hong Kong, unfortunately, never ever developed the art of managing and resolving political disputes and so on and so forth. So it's going through a painful learning phase. And the same way, I think in Taiwan or so, you might have short-term political problems, but by and large, both will remain more or less as autonomous economic entities benefiting from the growth of the region. And I want to emphasize, since I come from Singapore, and Singapore and Hong Kong are seen as competitors all the time, it is actually in Singapore's national interest to see Hong Kong thrive and succeed, because we need competition from another city-state, and therefore we can both do equally well.
Right up here.
Hi, my name is Chi, last name Jai. I work for the internal think tank unit of a large American company. Thank you for presenting a view that perhaps not to the sophisticated audience here at Kennedy School, but I think perhaps in the US in general, that is a little bit different. I follow non-Western, specifically Chinese press as well, and I think the point of view that you presented is quite normal from a non-Western press coverage point of view. But if we look at the average Western press and the public discourse here, and hence policy here, that point of view perhaps is odd. Just like you highlight with the Belgrade embassy bombing, we can actually have US and China looking at things from two totally different angles. So my question is, how do we bridge that public perception gap to then move toward more harmonious bilateral relations?
Yeah, I mean, I must say that that's a very difficult question, because I think that you know, as I get older, I get less and less surprised by things. You know, it's quite normal. But one thing that's really surprised me is that, on the one hand, the United States has clearly the freest media in the world, the best financed newspapers, the best financed television stations in the world. But I can tell you this, you know, as someone who travels to at least 30, 40 countries a year, when I come to the United States and I go to my hotel room in Charles Hotel and turn on the television, I feel that I've been cut off from the rest of the world. And literally, the insularity of the American discourse is actually frightening. And this is also true, by the way. I mean, I've said this to my friends there anyway in New York Times. This is true of the New York Times. This is true of the Washington Post. This is true of the Wall Street Journal. There is an incestuous, self-referential discourse among these newspaper journalists and so on and so forth. And they reinforce each other's perspectives and end up misunderstanding the world. Because, you know, the one key point I emphasize is that the era of Western domination of world history was a 200-year aberration. It's coming to an end. And as a result of it, you've got to learn to understand non-Western perspectives in the world. And it's actually quite frightening that in many ways I find American intellectuals behind intellectuals, including in Serbia, where I just was, or Greece, or in Istanbul, because they are much more aware of what's happening in the world than most American intellectuals are. I don't know how to solve that problem.
Right over here.
Thanks. My name is Ziad Raza. I'm a mid-career MPA candidate here, and also from Malaysia. So both Malaysia and Singapore and countries around East Asia have been benefiting greatly from the economic rise of China. We trade with China, we benefit from that. But there's also this specter of security. China's 9-dash claim on the South China Sea, some skirmishes along the way, and also the increasing militarization of China is growing defense budget. So my question to you is, I think the entire world is looking to see whether China is true to its rhetoric of peaceful rise, but it's particularly relevant for East Asia, because we're so nearby and we're directly affected by this. So what are your thoughts on China's rise as not just an economic power, but also potentially a military power as well?
Yeah, again, very quickly. Number one, overall, there's no doubt that China has been rising peacefully. But for some strange reason, And I would say in the years 2010 to 2012 or 13, China began to make serious mistakes in its foreign policy. The one big mistake it made, for example, was when the Japanese arrested the captain of a Chinese fishing trawler. The Chinese put enormous pressure on Japan to release the captain, and they succeeded. And then, foolishly, they asked Japan for an apology. And I told my Chinese friends, you already humiliated the Japanese by forcing them to release the captain of Chinese fishing trawler. Why humiliate them further by asking for an apology? Then, as you know, they made mistakes in the South China Sea. And for example, in the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in July 2012 in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, the ASEAN countries wanted to have the usual reference to South China Sea. China put pressure on Cambodia, the chairman, to block it. And then for the first time in 47 years, the ASEAN countries failed to produce their usual boring, long joint communique because of Chinese pressure. So they've made serious mistakes. But what is astonishing to me is how quickly they learn from the mistakes. And I can tell you one of the most surprising things I did in 2014 was to be invited to Beijing by two separate Chinese think tanks and in a fully recorded conversation, and they only asked me one question. Please tell me, what mistakes has China made in its foreign policy? And I was stunned by that because I've never been invited to Washington, D.C. to talk about mistakes in American foreign policy, but I get invited to Beijing. I mean, that's a sign of the times, that is how different the world is today. So I think the Chinese, I want to emphasize one point. The Chinese themselves have not clearly made up what kind of power they want to be, and they are torn by contradictory impulses. And that's how we react to them, how we act as a role model for them, that will make a huge difference. And here in the area of the military, I can tell you one key point I keep saying. It is now in America's national interest to stop aggressive naval patrolling 12 miles off China's shores, because if you do that 20 years from now, there'll be aggressive Chinese naval patrolling 12 miles off California's shores. Let's not push for that. Let's work towards a new world where we no longer have to use the military. And I think at the end of the day, there will be no war between the United States and China. Why not gradually de-escalate the military competition? I think it can be done.
Right over here.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Kishore, for the great presentation. My name is Xin Chai Zhang. I'm from China. It's a great honor to have this opportunity to talk about, to ask questions. I'm the founder of my lab tea company, and my question is: you talk about Mr. Xi Jinping and talking about our purpose to revive our culture. So, what do you think is China's core culture, and how Chinese core culture can contribute to the world, and what we can learn from other civilizations through this process? Thank you very much.
Well, I suspect there are many more experts in this room here on Chinese culture and civilization, but I can tell you that there are obviously many roots of wisdom in traditional Chinese culture. And I'm actually hoping that, if you look back over the longer history of China over the past 2,000 years or so, it's actually surprising how few military adventures the Chinese had overseas. And in general, they have actually, as you know, within the Chinese Confucian ethos, the guy who's a soldier is at the bottom of the value chain, right? So maybe developing an ethos in which the military is not so important is one possible thing that can emerge from Chinese culture and civilization. But you'll see things coming in many areas. For example, in the medical area, I think Chinese medicine will become more and more important. And just as, the Western medicine looks at the human body and tries to slice it up and looks at your kidney and looks at your liver and looks at your heart, the Chinese look at the whole system of the body and say, let's figure out the whole system. And I think in that sense, as Chinese medicine becomes, rejuvenates itself, it'll also make a development. So there are many other such places like this. And Chinese poetry, Chinese painting, all that will come back in a much stronger way. So you will actually see one of the happiest things I look forward to, for example, the next 20 years, is that there'll be not one but many major Asian cultural renaissances taking place in the world. And one of them will be from China.
Right up here.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Subin Kim. I'm a student at Harvard Law School. Thank you for coming to talk to us today. It was a great lecture. Some say AIIB is, in some sense, China's stepping stone towards possibly undermining U.S. dollar's position as a reserve currency and preparing itself as the new reserve currency for the world, or at least a competing alternative. I'm curious about your response to such arguments.
Oh, I think I don't think the AIIB is a step towards replacing the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency. It's actually the Chinese basically using the AIIB on the one hand to find a use for the money that they have, and on the other hand, there's also a demand in Asia for more infrastructure. Even the ADB has estimated that Asia needs $7 trillion of infrastructure, and that's what it's using its money for. But at the same time, I do agree with you also that the Chinese have begun thinking about how long can they rely on the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Because traditionally, the reserve currency is always the reserve currency of the world's number one economic power. Now, China is not yet in nominal terms the number one economic power, but within 5 years, 10 years, depending on your guesswork on what the rates of growth will be, China will become the world's number one economic power, let's say within 10 years. And then in that world, if you have a world in which China is the number one world economic power and the US dollar remains as the global reserve currency, that will be a major global contradiction. So it's actually better for us now to find a solution to that global contradiction before it becomes a big problem, because this will definitely be a big problem 10 years from now.
Right over here.
Yes, my name is Charles Data. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. Arguably, in the era of US superpower, democracy could be argued as the main value that the US has been pushing around the world. How about when we imagine the day that China will be a superpower, what do you think will be the main agenda that will be pushed around the world?
Okay, let me begin with the good news. They will not ask any country in the world to set up a communist party. I guarantee you that. I actually believe in the long run, China itself will eventually become a democracy. The destination is not in doubt. It's only the route and timing that you take. And I can tell you the Chinese learned so much from the collapse of the Soviet Communist Party, because the Soviet Union went overnight from a communist system to a democracy. The Russian economy imploded, became smaller than Belgium. Infant mortality rates went up, life expectancy came down, and the Chinese saw that and said, we don't want to see that in China. So they will not make an immediate transition towards democracy, but in the long run, I think they'll move in that direction. But unlike the United States of America, the Chinese do not believe in proselytizing their beliefs. They do not believe that you have to copy or emulate them to succeed. And they also believe that it is far better for people to admire and respect them for their deeds rather than to pay attention to their words. So in a sense, we will have a very different world when the world's number one power in the world is no longer a missionary power in the world.
Right over here.
Irv Plotkin from Technological Institution down the river. My question is similar to the one that was just asked. I think your point is very well taken, that you learn how to behave when you're not number one by looking at the person who's now number one. We're good to our parents, so our children will take care of us in our old age. But how many years after China becomes number one do you think there would be real press freedom, or artists would have freedom, or the Dalai Lama could come to Tibet? How will that ever really happen with the communist dynasty that you praise, which you can only get away with in Cambridge, by the way?
Well, the question of freedom in China, I think, is a very critical question. I first went to China in 1980, and I arrived in Beijing. For a start, there were no skyscrapers, there were big roads, there were no cars, only bicycles. People at that time could not have the freedom to choose where to live, where to work, what to wear, No, not any kind of personal freedom. Today, you go to China, the Chinese people can choose where to live, where to work, what to study, what to wear, where to go. And when I first went to China in 1980, there wasn't a single Chinese tourist leaving China. Last year, 100 million Chinese went overseas freely. And 100 million Chinese returned to China freely. Now, if there's no freedom in China, if China was this despotic, oppressive state, would 100 million Chinese come back to China? So clearly there has been an explosion of personal freedoms in China on a scale that the Chinese people haven't experienced, right? Now, you mentioned difficult things like the Dalai Lama. And I agree with you that China should deal with the Dalai Lama. But isn't it shocking that the United States of America, which is the world's freest society in many ways, actually prevented some Islamic scholars from coming to teach in American universities barely 10 years ago? That's shocking. So, and all I can say to you is, no country is perfect. Every country has got to learn to improve itself.
Kishore, I wanted to take advantage of my position here to ask you a question that no one else has seemed to ask, but since you asked it rhetorically yourself, is after Lee Kuan Yew, can Singapore survive?
My favorite answer is buy the book. No, I did.
That's not generally an acceptable answer here. So.
I know. No. I did launch a book 3 weeks ago in Singapore called "Can Singapore Survive?" But I'm actually, the answer I gave is very simple. The probability, of course, is that Singapore will survive. I mean, Singapore will not just survive, Singapore will do very well. Because, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the founding leaders of Singapore created some of the strongest institutions in the world in some areas. The quality of mind of the Singapore civil service, I think, is number one in the world. The quality of mind of the Singapore judiciary is also probably number one in the world. The quality of the Singapore military is probably among the top 10 in the world. Singapore's education system is already ranked among the top 3 or 4 in the world. We have the world's best airport, the world's best functioning port. So we have created a whole ecosystem of excellence in Singapore. And with that ecosystem of excellence, Singapore is poised to take advantage of a major historical opportunity that is coming its way, because just as London served the European century and New York served the American century, the one city in all of Asia that is comfortable with all the major civilizations in Asia, with Chinese civilization, with Indian civilization, with Islamic civilization, and also Western civilization, is Singapore. So Singapore is going to become the New York of the Asian century. So it's a great time coming ahead for Singapore.
But, okay, right there.
My name is Ihab Gamal. I'm a mid-career from the troubled area of the Middle East. My question to you is that do you have any doubt about China's economic growth going forward? So the rise to the number one is based on a wondrous story of 8% growth year over year.
Yeah.
Demographically, there's a lot of challenges in the economy. Do you see this story really continuing to become the nominal number one in the world?
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that question because I've been here for 48 hours. And I must say, almost every person I met in Harvard, the first question they ask me when we talk about China is, can China sustain its economic growth? And of course, it's possible that there could be a massive slowdown in China. They could grow at 3-4% or whatever. So that's possible. But if I was a betting man, I'm prepared to take bets with you all that I think China will be able to sustain growth of 7%. Now, there's a very good reason why the Chinese have decided to slow down their economic growth, because they are now shifting from one model of economic growth to another model of economic growth. They used to rely a lot on export-led growth. They can no longer do that because they're no longer the big markets in the West that they can rely on. They're trying to switch to an internal consumption-led growth. And it takes time to do that. And if you are running a fast train around a corner, it's best to slow down and do that. And secondly, if you look at the amount of investments that China has put in, the infrastructure, the world-class infrastructure that China has built in their ports, airports, roads, rail, and so on and so forth, that kind of world-class infrastructure reaps dividends. Plus, the Chinese Communist Party is in many ways one of the most meritocratic organizations in the world, and the quality of mind of key Chinese policymakers has never been as good as it is today. Now, if you have a government staffed by remarkably good minds taking advantage of a world-class infrastructure, I would say the possibility of maintaining good growth is there. And within Asia, by the way, China is big, but even the Chinese are 1.3 billion people, but in all of Asia, there are 3.4 billion people. That market is becoming more integrated too. So that you'll also benefit from the integration of that region. So there are many other sources of growth apart from the export-led growth that they had in the past. So if I was a betting man, I would say they can sustain the 7% growth.
All right, I'm afraid we have time for just two more questions right there.
Hi, my name is Jack Mulhern. I'm a former tour guide at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. I just had a quick question. One thing, it's a great honor to have you here, first of all. But I attended the law school about 6 months ago, and Tommy Koh, the U.S. ambassador to Singapore, he posited a theory that 11 times one country has always been on top, and they've always, in the history of humanity, been superseded by the country in number two. I'm just wondering if this is inevitable due to what I've noticed China's doing. They're buying factories in Indiana that are producing rare earth elements that we need for our cell phones and our F-14 and F-16 fighter jets and so forth. And I'm not saying that they're not benign. I'm just saying that this is what's happening. And so I'm wondering it's an inevitability that the country who's always number two supersedes the country that's now economically number one.
Well, I'm not... Tommy Koh, by the way, is a Singapore ambassador, former Singapore ambassador to the US, a brilliant guy. In fact, I succeeded him as ambassador to the UN. I would say, of course, it's never inevitable that the number two will overtake number one. As you know, Japan was supposed to overtake, and I see that Professor Ezra Vogel has left, but he wrote the famous book saying Japan is number one, and the Japanese never became number one. That happens from time to time. And it's conceivable that China will not become number one. It's conceivable. But, the probability is very clear that, if you have a country with a population of 1.3 billion people, China, and a country of 300 million people, United States, if the average Chinese can perform at 25% the level of the average American, China will have a bigger economy. And if you have any doubts about the capacity of the Chinese mind to do well, look at the exam results of Chinese students in any leading American university, right? You look at the list of PhDs that come to collect, you see the success of the Chinese intellectuals. So what's happening here, by the way, is that, I always say that, Western education was developed for the Western mind. But one thing we haven't noticed is that in the last 10 years, when you take Western education and you combine it with the Asian mind, including the Chinese mind, it has an explosive effect. So the Asians are thriving with Western education, and inevitably this is going to fuel the rise of China in a big way. And I'm very confident that the average Chinese can perform more than 25% the level of the average American. And that's why I think China will have a bigger economy.
Right over here, I'm afraid the last question.
Hello, my name is Mabo Wesley. I'm a student at the business school. Thank you for being here this evening. My question is, how would you characterize in all likelihood the U.S.-China relationship, specifically in the range of 15 to 25 years, where while China will likely be number one, the U.S. will likely be a close number two?
Yeah, of course, it's possible that the United States will be a close number two to China. But many of the projections that I've seen, I'll give you, for example, Goldman Sachs has projected that by 2050, the number one economy in the world will be China, and I've been speaking a lot about China. The number two economy in the world will be India, and the United States will be number three. So, and it's actually surprising that so few Americans speak about that world. It's already impossible to speak about being number two. It's even harder to speak about being number three. But that, frankly, is also going to happen. I wrote an essay recently in which I said that, if you look at the most successful ethnic community in the United States, I would have thought in the past would have been the Japanese or the Chinese or the Koreans or the Jews. But the most successful ethnic community in the United States by far is the ethnic Indian community. And if you look at one statistic, if the average Indian in India can achieve half the per capita income of the average Indian in America, India's GNP would not be 2 trillion, but 25 trillion. And if you go to India, as I do, the sense of optimism about the future is phenomenal. So I've been talking a lot about China, but there's actually another bigger Asian story. There's also India and other states that are doing very well. So in that world of tomorrow, it is just by sheer mathematical logic. The amount of space that 300 million Americans have carved out for themselves, politically, economically, when they represent less than 5% of the world's population, has been phenomenal, has been exceptional. But it cannot carry on because the rest of the world has stopped underperforming. And if they start performing normally, and America will continue to remain a strong, dynamic, successful country, but its relative share of the global GNP can only shrink.
好，问答环节就到这里。不知道大家看完是什么感受？我个人最佩服的是马凯硕在回答这些问题时所展现出来的从容和智慧。面对挑战，他从不回避，总是能用数据、事实或者一个巧妙的比喻来重新定义提问者的问题，并引导对方进入一个更广阔的视角去思考。比如他用1亿人自由出入境来回应自由问题，用邀请我去批评中国外交来对比中美两国的开放心态。我看过他很多不同场合的演讲和访谈，我发现一个很有意思的现象。虽然他的核心思想是一以贯之的，有些经典的例子也会反复提及，但每一次的表达都不是简单的重复，他总能根据不同的语境给出新的视角或者补充新的论据，让人常看常新，总能有新的收获。好，今天的分享就到这里，感谢大家收看，咱们下次再见。